welcome to Abu Sulaiman Center for Global Islamic Studies guest lecture series with Dr. Annika Schmeding. Schmeding? Am I pronouncing this correctly, Dr. Schmeding?
Yeah, Schmeding. It's a complicated German name.
Okay, Annika Schmeding, yeah. Dr. Annika Schmeding, we are very delighted to have you with us today. The title of Dr. Schmeding's talk is Sufi Civilities, Religious Authority, and Political Change in Afghanistan. My name is Yasemin İpek. I am an assistant professor in global affairs. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and my work specializes on activism and humanitarianism in Lebanon, Turkey, and the US. I want to express my special thanks to the Abu Sulaiman Center for Global Islamic Studies, in particular to the director and the research director, the director Peter, the research director Sumaya Hamdani, and giving me for this opportunity to connect our teaching to the center's community-based public event series. I also want to thank Aisha Noor and Robert for behind the door doing a lot of work for the preparation. The mission of Abu Sulaiman Center for Global Islamic Studies is to advance a sound and nuanced understanding of Islam and Muslims, the role of Islam in world history and its current patterns of globalization. The center supports research, interdisciplinary academic programs, and community outreach. And we are meeting here today as part of my anthropology class, Peoples and Cultures of the Middle East. And of course, thank you everyone for coming here. Thank you, my students, for doing the reading. Because nobody nowadays do any reading. So I'm very grateful to everyone interested in this topic. And let me briefly introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Annika Schmeding is lecturer at the University of Amsterdam and the senior researcher at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. She earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from Boston University and was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University Society of Fellows. She is the current lead researcher in the Dutch parliamentary inquiry investigating the NATO-led war in Afghanistan. As a cultural anthropologist with over a decade of research experience in Afghanistan and the wider region, her work examines the impact of war, violence, and migration of civilians, with particular focus on minority communities. Her professional experience ranges from research for private sector companies, NGOs, and national government to expert testimony in international court cases. She's the author of Sufi Civilities, Religious Authority, and Political Change in Afghanistan that came out of Stanford University Press in 2023, and which received very deservedly several awards. And she's the co-editor of Frontier Ethnographic, Deconstructing Research Experiences in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Her work has been published in leading journals such as the Afghanistan Journal, Journal of Ethnographic Theory, the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and cultural magazines such as Alom, Zenith, and the Cabinet Magazine. Everyone, please join me welcoming Dr. Schmeding.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yasmin, for a really, really kind introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Yasmin and Aisha Noor, for inviting me to this talk today. And also thank you to the Abu Sulaiman Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University for setting up this talk and for also welcoming me here today. I wish I could be with you actually in person. I'm chiming in from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam. I wished I could rather sit with you and eat and discuss, but I'm glad that I can be with you in this digital format. And I'm aware that the past weeks and months have not been easy for our academic communities, and even more so, I appreciate the invitation and also the time that you've taken out to be here today and to discuss my book. As we have a few technical glitches, I'm very thankful actually that you're going to help me with going forward with the PowerPoint. So thank you so much for that as well. So where to start? In one of my first talks, I was actually accused later by a couple of students that I did not directly properly define what or who a Sufi is. And they apparently had started Googling at the start of my talk. So I don't want to make that mistake again. I don't actually think that this would be a problem here at George Mason University Center for the Study of Global Islam. But if studying Sufism has taught me anything, then it's that people understand what it is in very different ways. So therefore, I will start with a broad definition of who a Sufi is so that I can then also deconstruct that very definition together with you during the talk. Because actually also the disagreement over what or who a Sufi is also at the center of some of the debates that I'm dealing with in my book. So if you could go back to the next slide, that'd be nice. Yes, okay. So in a very simplified rendering and following also here the understanding of my own interlocutors, a Sufi is a Muslim who is on a mystic or spiritual path of learning. Any of these terms, of course, mysticism, spiritualism, you know, they're very complicated and contested as well in usage. But the Sufi path is one of experience, and it's about getting closer to God or the divine and to experience, to have an experiential experience as well with that. It's not a sect like Sunnism or Shiism, but an orientation and a path on the search for the inner meaning of the Quran and the message of the Prophet Muhammad. And in Afghanistan, it's usually spoken about as irfan or gnosis, another complicated term in itself, or tasawwuf, so Sufism and mysticism. I hope to return with you later to this, actually, but I believe it's helpful to first set out how I also got to this research, how I researched on Sufism in Afghanistan, and what a lens on Sufism as civil society can lend us when we try to understand dynamics in Muslim communities. So I started working and researching in Afghanistan in 2011, but I did not start researching on Sufism in the country until 2015. I had spent already time in Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Pakistan, which are all actually countries, of course, with a sizable Sufi presence and also literature about Sufism in these countries. And I was sitting at lunch with an Afghan friend of mine who was at the time a director of a research institute. Maybe you could go to the next slide. Thank you. And I asked him what had happened to all the Sufis in Afghanistan. I asked him where they're all gone, because after all, of course, Afghanistan had once been also the cradle of mystic interpretation of Islam and the place of the origin of Maulana Jalaluddin Balkhi, known in the West as Rumi. So when I asked that question whether all Sufis had disappeared, my friend Ruhullah just laughed at me and said, well, they're still here. You foreigners just don't ask about them. All you care about is gender counterinsurgency and nation building. So my book is basically a very delayed answer to this discussion with him in asking what the experiences of Sufi communities have been during the past 20 years of NATO military intervention, and also the longer history of over 4 decades of war in Afghanistan. And in my book, I look at how Sufi communities dealt with external challenges, such as the experience of violence in war, regime changes, targeted killings, and the destruction of Sufi infrastructure, but also internal changes and challenges, such as the death of a leader or teacher, or changes to outmigration to other countries during the war. And I pay special attention to the ways any of these challenges are negotiated through religio-cultural tools, such as dream divination, poetry as Islamic education, book publishing, or relationally established authority. And I'm happy to talk about any of these more if you're interested in any one particular as well. If you could go to the next slide. As you can see in my methodological approach, I approach Sufi communities with basically this, the kind of toolkit that most anthropologists actually do their research. So I did participant observation in 6 different communities, particularly in 2 urban sites in Herat and in Kabul. I was mainly based in Herat. And some additional exploratory sites such as Kandahar, Mazar-e-Sharif, Parvan, some other provinces. And I did qualitative interviews in these communities with teachers as well as students. Some of these communities also opened up private archival material. And with some of the members, I also practiced something that's called dialogical writing. So I actually shared some of the writing that I did with some of my interviewees, and they commented on it, and we discussed how I was portraying what they were doing. So if you could go to the next slide. So how did that actually look like? So these are some of the photos from my field research at the time. On, I believe this must be the left side for you as well. You see some photos from Kabul Public Library, where Ustad Haidari Wujudi was teaching at the time. So I didn't only research in Sufi lodges, but also actually in places where Sufi poetry was taught and explained. On the right side, you see a private library where I was researching, as well as an event of an Urs where people were getting together. If you could go to the next slide. There's also, of course, some of the interviews, but also then some of the newer constructions, for example, of the one on the left is a newly constructed shrine that was constructed during the time that I was doing research. And on the right side, you see actually a very important place as well in Old Kabul that was attacked and burned down during the time that I was doing research there. This was also a ziyarat. So what is interesting, particularly, I guess, for most anthropologists, is that many times in our research, insights happen to come to us rather from the side as from maybe the main places of our focus. And that was also the case for me with an event of one of the Sufi poetry circles. If you could go to the next slide. Which was at a halqa, where I first heard someone referring to the Sufi groups as a form of civil society. So this actually was, you see here, Asma Majur, a poet and Sufi teacher in her late 30s, who is speaking at the podium of the death celebration, or the Urs, of her father, her late father, Ustad Majur, who had been an expert on poetry of Bedel Delawi, and who had passed away just a year before that. And as she actually started in her into her speech, which I was recording at the time, it was somebody sitting next to me who said these words that you see right now on the slide, which is, "This is the real Afghan civil society. There's no funding for this, but it exists and continues nonetheless. It's the resistance of a nation to organize these social, cultural, and religious events to keep the memory of who we are alive." And what she said struck me for several reasons. So on the one hand, she was making fun of a buzzword that was at the time prevalent in Afghanistan, civil society, and it also came with certain connotations. So usually it was thought of as being funded by the West, organized in an NGO format, and that was the target of her joking remark. Interestingly, she was also herself part of the NGO scene because she was the director of a large NGO, but she was also actually from a traditionally influential family. And so I kind of started asking, like, okay, so how are these things connected? Sufi communities, as well as this kind of civil sphere where they are active. So if you go on further, yes. Oh, thank you. That's perfect. So I already mentioned this kind of individual path, of course, that a Sufi would be on as a murid, a student of a teacher. Usually this is an educational relationship, and in a traditional form, usually by joining a Sufi order. In Afghanistan, this actually was a lot of times multiple affiliation, actually being affiliated with multiple Sufi orders at the same time as well. And it was also not always formally acknowledged with a pledge. So these things have also been changing. But there's also a broader kind of Sufi social sphere of meeting circles, meetings at shrines, of the ziyarats, and at lodges for classes, celebrations, or also collective rituals. And what is interesting in that, of course, when you start researching in these different communities, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. There's one or two more. Yeah, perfect. Is that when researching these different communities, you also see that they come at a full spectrum, basically, of different Sufi groups. They're not one consolidated unit or group. They come not only from different lineages of learning, but also they have kind of different ways how they are positioned theologically in their interpretations, in their practices, but also in terms socially, how they are positioned vis-a-vis politics. And so when kind of comparing them or trying to understand what their experiences have been, this is also, of course, something to take into consideration. If you could go to the next part. And one of the aspects of that, one more, thank you, is that has helped me think about this is what the late Shahab Ahmad was saying, as one might say, that the community of Islam is a community of disagreement over the question of what Islam is. I mean, this is, of course, like quite a jab at these different renderings and different understandings of what Islam is. But one could extend that, of course, to the question of Sufism as well, and the place of Sufism within Islam, and also as what we understand Sufism to be. And I'm just put two photos here actually to refer to two aspects of that. On the one hand, of course, we have the cosmology within Sufism that defines that there's different levels of knowledge on this path of learning, and therefore also different levels of closeness to the divine, which of course brings up the question whether a teacher or leader would become an intermediary between believers and God, and whether that leader would take on a deified position. And this had brought, of course, a lot of disagreement outside of Sufi communities, where Sufis also have been accused of blasphemy sometimes. And another aspect, of course, of this question of like how the Sufi path is to be understood and what belongs to it is also, of course, the question of music. The left photo is of a musician, Ustad Ikhtiyar, who is a Sufi musician in Herat. He actually at some point stopped playing in Sufi lodges because of the threats that he received. And in the middle picture, you see a picture of a Sufi shrine in Ashekan wa Arifan in Old Kabul that was burned to the ground after the community had received threats because they had hosted also zikr with music in their place on Thursday. So of course, while I'm pointing here at the more extreme examples in which these disagreements led to violent encounters, overall, of course, Sufi interpretations and their presence within Muslim communities have been an important force in the creation of a civil space in which discussion and intellectual disagreements could also take place. And this is, of course, based on, if you could put the next slide, this is based on an understanding from kind of Sufism having been historically as well an important driving force for what one could call civility or the civil space. Could you put the next slide? That would be very nice. Thank you so much. Yes, there is a lot of stuff on that slide, but it's just to show actually the background of this, which of course comes from Armando Salvatore's work as well, with this understanding that Sufism has, of course, in a long history of Islam, be a source of civility through the horizontal networks and also translocal connectedness that we find through these Sufi orders. Sufi lodges historically have, of course, been nodes for long-distance travelers and sanctuaries. Peers regularly mediated or resolved problems in communities writ large, and also Sufi orders were a connection to a wide variety of individuals of social classes and regions. So this actually has led me, if you could go to the next slide, to this looking at Sufi communities as creating these social networks of trust that also define identities and belonging, and that fulfill these important functions as well in socialization, social cohesion, public communication of ideas, some also for resource distribution and mediation of conflicts. So why does this rendering that seems pretty self-explanatory maybe contrast so much with what we're usually hearing about Afghanistan's society or its civil society sphere? If you could go to the next slides. It is, of course, because civil society was thought of as a part of the state building process in Afghanistan since 2001. This is just like a Google search for Afghan civil society that I made and that I screenshotted. So NATO countries such as the Netherlands, where I am currently Germany and the US, they applied these neoliberal development policies in which NGOs offered services to citizens that otherwise governments would fulfill. So NGOs were framed as a way to effectively assist implementation of government liberalization reform and efficiently fill service delivery functions. And so for this reason, civil society in Afghanistan has been mainly understood as English-speaking, NGO-connected strata of society that was engaged to serve as local implementers in the development and reconstruction sector. And that is, of course, not uncommon in the global development sector. So we find this in many other places as well. But they were very explicitly framed as central to the post-2001 peace and state building process. And this means that projects and programs were designed to create and support a particular framing of civil society, and donors supported formally established, technically oriented organization. And it doesn't mean that they not only contributed, sometimes they did contribute in many meaningful ways as well to Afghanistan society, but our understanding of the full scope of what the civil sphere means remains limited if we only conceive of it through the persons and organizations connected to the international community. And even more so, if you could go to the next slide, there is another dimension in Afghanistan in the past 20 years. Formal organization in the civil sphere have been useful in the NATO-led war of the last 2 decades. So in an attempt to humanize the war, NGOs were considered by political and military elites in the United States as a force multiplier and an important part of our combat team, as General Colin Powell stated in 2001 when he was Secretary of State. So building an effective civil society was part also of counterinsurgency strategies intended to show that services were delivered to constituents and to cast the international community in a positive light. So I will not further go into this here, but I think it shows the dimension that the civil sphere has taken in Afghanistan in these last decades and the social and political environment that also the Sufi groups had to navigate. Of course, Afghanistan was not and has never been without its own civil society groups anchored in indigenous movements. If you could go to the next one, please. And there's, of course, a long tradition of informal and resourceful civic engagement that long predates formalized NGOs in which people also come together in their communities on a voluntary basis to improve local infrastructure called ashar, or to support people in need through khairat donations, or to mediate disputes through councils. And the networks that I mean here often already exist, but they also spring into action when need arises. So these 2 photos actually are from the COVID-19 pandemic. But of course, it also becomes apparent, for example, in the large-scale earthquakes that hit Afghanistan in 2022 and also in 2023. For example, in Herat, where I've conducted most of my field research. And I just want to mention these examples because it shows how there are these informal mechanisms that are not NGO-led, where people themselves come together to actually bring together what a state could otherwise provide. But in this moment, it becomes the communities across the country that turn to informal mechanisms to support each other. And this, even though this right now, these 2 examples here are not directly from a Sufi community or for a Sufi group, they have another meaning as well from the people who we interviewed back then. Because such solidarity networks are organized around the concept of khairat, which means, of course, doing good or rewards for goodness. And khairat refers for many types of charity, almsgiving, distribution of food, supporting people in need. But these examples here, they also had this other aspect of to take care of the status and the community, in how one interviewee actually talked about it, in this world and the next, dunya wa akhirat. So it was ensuring everybody is cared for in this life and the next. So it had very particular also religious connotations. And on the right hand, you also actually see that these networks also are adaptive. So this was for an attack on a maternity ward in 2020 when gunmen stormed a government-run maternity hospital with 24 people dead, including mothers, nurses, 2 newborns. And this was one of the babies that survived. And it was one of these networks that had actually supported healthcare access to people during COVID, that then started also caring for the survivors. So these are some of the more generalized networks that exist in Afghanistan society. But I also became to know more of the particular individual Sufi teachers and their efforts within their communities and what they were doing. If you could go to the next slide, thank you so much. And I think the interesting aspect of that is how individual Sufi teachers and their efforts within their community also brought this other question, of course, of charity work, of not only connected with their own beliefs and relationship to God, but also with their position of leadership within their communities. So these are some photos from Asma Majur, whose speech I mentioned at the outside of the talk. And she actually engaged on the one hand in many of the kind of typical activities of a Sufi leader. So she was organizing yearly Sufi celebrations, offering lessons on poetry of Bedel Delawi. She was publishing books for spiritual nourishment of her followers. But she was also active in service delivery functions, which are often posed as the purview of formal organizations or institutions. And these activities kind of superseded giving or ventured into more kind of development initiatives. So this is from 2022, when she collected donations online to drill a well and make safe drinking water available to the mountainside community residing close to her father's grave. And unlike other formal organizations, the construction was not financed through approved international grants, but crowdsourced from the wider Sufi community inside Afghanistan as well as the diaspora. So once drilling and the construction was well underway, the estimated cost doubled and superseded the amounts that Asma had. If you could go to the next slide. So she reached out again to the wider community, and this was from a conversation we had in Kabul in 2022, where she talks about that they didn't have the money for actually paying fully for it, and she reached out again on a Facebook page. So social media plays a huge role in that as well. Reaching out and telling them, well, we love humanity, we also love our country, so we should be actually doing something for our countrymen. So the language that Asma uses here to describe her approach, insaniyat, or humanity, is at once ingrained with the discourse of Sufism that she teaches, and simultaneously a direct juxtaposition to how she sees organizations acting in the post-2001 internationalized sphere of humanitarianism and development. And so what we kind of see as well with some of that, like some of the additional money that she also got, went then to a nearby mosque, an imam. So there's wider circuits as well into which this feeds in. But also one of the reasons how she actually went about this is that she posted all of the amounts that she took in and that she was spending on her Facebook page. And one of the ways how she talked about it was that she actually also knows as a teacher that she can easily be accused of embezzlement, of just pocketing the money. So she posted all of the financial flows on Facebook to be transparent. So this is actually then also connects with the way how she's aware of her own position as a teacher. And if you could go to next, thank you. So what can we, of course, gain if we looked at Sufi communities and Sufism, not as an individualized community or a particular minority, but also as a lens to understanding Afghanistan society more broadly? And this is also at the core of what I'm also interested in. So this wider understanding of how Sufism is anchored within Afghanistan society also leads us into different spheres. If you could go to next. We have of course, like Sufism played a major role in Afghanistan's history of Islamic education. So historically, for example, Sufi and poetry collections were used to teach Islam next to the Quran in mosques. So there were prominent collections such as Panjganj and Kulliyat al-Chahar Kitab, who gave ethical guidelines in how to make decisions. So people used to learn them by heart, understand them, and also understand then a particular way of ethical being in the world through this poetry. And this was a very normal way actually to include actually Sufi thought in Islamic education. If you could go to next. Of course, by now, Sufi poetry has become a part of the national intangible heritage. So poetry collection used to be very regularly actually gifted by politicians, for example, to anybody visiting them. On the right side, you see here actually which is the presumed house of Rumi's father in Balkh. So by now, actually, there's things have been constructed over it. So there's also this construction of like, how do we visit these places and give reverence to them. But also, yes, thank you. If you could go, perfect. But also Sufi communities have been very active in including themselves and in shaping some of these developments. So you see Asma Majur here on the left, whose family has been very active in teaching the poetry of Bedel Delawi. And they made very direct connections, for example, with singers and musicians such as Ustad Sarahang, who you see on the right, who then included a lot of Bedel's poetry into his songs. And he was the first musician, actually, one of the first two musicians to be allowed to play live on Radio Afghanistan when it was instituted. So they were very active, actually, to also get outside of these smaller circles and have a much wider dissemination as well of Sufi thought. So, but when we start perceiving Sufis as integral part of Afghanistan society, then the next crucial question is, of course, what these communities on the one hand had to endure in past decades and how they navigated Afghanistan's history and how they've also intangible and oblique ways impacted the course of Afghanistan's history. So in my book, I outline roughly 3 strategies that individuals and groups have engaged in during the past decades and centuries, also to position themselves vis-a-vis the state. So the first one is state alignment. Over the centuries, of course, as you might know, many rulers in various parts of the world have attached themselves to Sufi peers or followed their guidance. The Seljuks of Rome, the Mevlevi-guided Ottoman rulers, the Iranian Safavid dynasty, the Timurid Empire. And in all of these different places, patronage could stem from a ruler's own individual affinity to Sufi interpretations to Islam, but these allegiances also had very tangible benefits. So as Walid Ziad has explored in his wonderful work on Sufism in Central and South Asia, for example, the newly established states often lacked historical legitimacy and required the backing of a spiritual institutional base that could provide blessings and social capital. So Sufi scholars offered historically grounded symbolic capital that worked to integrate these various rural, tribal, or urban environments through political, commercial, and spiritual mediation. And Sufi scholars similarly used the economic and political advantages afforded to them to bolster their claims of authority. And so we don't only find this, of course, in further history, but also more closely in the last few centuries. So there's important Sufi state alliances, such as the Gailani family from the Qadiriyya order, who were originally from present-day Iraq and then arrived in Afghanistan in 1905, where they were welcomed by the ruler Amir Habibullah and received monthly allowances and also places in the country. Or the Mujadidi family with another famous Sufi state alliance of the Naqshbandiya order. And they arrived in Afghanistan in the current iteration in the 18th century, but later on as well, were part of the government, such as Fazl Omar Mujadidi, who was the Minister of Justice. His son-in-law became deputy minister, and his brother, for example, ambassador to Egypt. So, and this is we're looking at the 1930s here. So these alliances actually reach much further also in more recent past. The second one, of course, is resistance. In many parts of the Islamic world, Sufis were, and in some cases still are, known to be fierce critics of reigning powers. And especially, of course, during times of colonial expansion, this was the case. Sufi peers and brotherhoods were often one of the authoritative structures left intact to oppose political takeover. So we see this in Algeria, Caucasus, Libya, but also actually much closer to Afghanistan in British India and the Afghan-Indian frontier, where several Sufi groups fought colonial powers, such as Sayyid Ahmad Bareilwi's Muhammadiyya Tariqa, that attacked the British alongside the Hada Mullah and Saidullah Khan, who was also dubbed the Mad Mullah by the British. So these patterns can, of course, also be found in present times with Sufi scholars as critics of the government. And here I want to give, if you could go to next slide, just one example that this is not only an example that's either or. So one group or one person can also be part of the government and attacking the government. It can be one and the same person. So, for example, Zibratullah Mujadidi was part of the Afghan government. His family was alternatingly part of the government, sometimes fierce critics of them. And however, also in the 1980s, the Mujadidis went into opposition against the Soviet-backed PDPA government and became one of the Mujahideen fighting groups. So we see these different positions also playing out in Afghanistan's more recent history. If you could go to next. But I think that there's kind of it's good to stay with the Thank you so much for doing it. It's a bit confusing. These two strategies are maybe the most well known, but also there's a third one, which I called strategic distance. And I found that when we approach Sufi communities, not only from like the center of power, but also decentered, not from a state-centric view, we find that many Sufis also chose this third option and what I call the strategic distance. So Sufi communities have, of course, primarily existed as localized social groups affiliated to particular peers or high-ranking students with teaching authority invested in them by their affiliation to a peer, without any overt political affiliation to central government structures. And then the question becomes, of course, can we call this strategic? If it is just part of who they are and how they operate and what they do, is this actually a strategy, right? As kind of like aligning with the government or being in opposition to it. But I would say in some cases we can. So on the one hand, distance to centers of powers likely emerged as a feature of daily life rather than a sought out strategies initially. But it's also that in times, particularly in my interviews, in times of crisis, in times of war, actually it can become a particular strategy. And how does it do that? So of course, sometimes this means physical removal, necessity to move. It can also mean avoiding interaction with government representatives or insurgents. It can mean re-establishing their community in different region. It can mean discursive distancing, so not writing for or against the government or having a quietist stance. It also can mean changing or curtailing of rituals to draw less attention to their community. It can also mean self-censorship. So all of these things are, of course, can also be choices in a particular moment then. And I think it is then about kind of like contextually reading what we find and what we see. And what we already see in these examples, of course, is that these strategies or actions is that the navigation is not only of direct violence, but also of navigation of shifting discourses of Islamic authority and of political power that impact these communities as well. And if you could go to the next. And so the shift that in Islamic discourse that emerged out of the war against the Soviets, kind of starting with kind of the coup in 1979 and 1978, and then the Soviets invading to support the government that had formed during that time. And then kind of the fighting that started against the Soviet-backed regime in Kabul, supported by the United States and other countries. This also meant that many resistance fighters from abroad joined the fight. And this actually, what you see here, this green building is one of the Sufi lodges in which I researched in Kabul. And the reason why we see here kind of like a modern box-shaped green building is the many times it had to be rebuilt, because it was actually at the fault lines of some of the fighting and it was destroyed several times. So this is why I brought this photo in and want to talk a tiny bit and in my last few minutes that I have about this. If you could go to the next. Here are a few historic photos from Kabul when the war came into urban warfare. And if you go to next, we actually see the destruction of the Khanaqah, or of the Sufi lodge, and how it had to be actually rebuilt at the time. This is Khanaqah Pahlavan in Old Kabul, which at various points during the civil war in the early 1990s was destroyed and looted by Mujahideen factions, and which then had to be rebuilt by the community itself. And what was also navigated by the community at the time was, of course, not only this physical destruction, but also ideological changes. So the national jihad that the Afghan yeah, you can go to next, perfect. The national jihad that the Afghan Resistance Party started developed into a global enterprise through the ideological, institutional, and financial support brought by a rather small group that would later be called the Afghan Arabs. And their involvement introduced, on the one hand, tensions between fighters from differing backgrounds, such as between Afghan Mujahideen and Arab fighters who criticized local customs, such as flags on shrines or graves. But on the other hand, also sparked a broader process, which one of my Afghan interlocutors, a businessman in his 30s, described as what he, in this quote that you see here, as social erosion. So it was actually a shift in different respects, in education, at school, in the way how people interacted with each other overall. He also points out here some of the gender dimension of that, which of course we see up until today, how some of these things have severely changed. And it was this restructuring of the way of being and thinking of how to be good and lead an ethical life, which was also intimately bound up with everyday Islamic norms, but also with the question of who holds power to enforce rules and set norms. So contrary to the way the Mujahideen were publicized and celebrated in the West during the anti-Soviet jihad, the Islamically justified restrictions and rules were similar to those of the Taliban who followed. Veiling increased, for example, in the refugee camps in Pakistan. Music was outlawed in parts of the country, and the living situation for women also worsened. And the war effort privileged power brokers and Islamically justified violence, such as the Mujahideen, or local religious functionaries, such as imams, who were legitimated through their titles and positions in these communities. And so what actually happened in this particular community, and some of you students who have read part of these chapters, if you go to the next image, is that some of these communities had to seek ways how to keep themselves safe. This is a photo of Haji Saikal, who is an imam who had his own mosque in another part of town in Kabul, in Mikrorayon, which was a Soviet-built area. And when from this particular Sufi community from the Khanaqah Pahlavan, when the family who had led this particular Sufi lodge for over 2 centuries, when they left the country because of the violence got too bad, they decided to give the Sufi lodge to this imam to caretake on this Sufi lodge. And these are the kind of alliances and practical applications that some of them I trace in these histories of these particular individual communities that I'm looking at. And he used his double function as being an imam in his own mosque and having madrasa, and actually also being then the caretaker of the Sufi lodge, to also keep the Sufi lodge open. So he negotiated in his position as an imam, or a mullah, as he's also sometimes was called, to actually negotiate for the Sufi community. And we find many of these adaptations and these navigations that are happening also in the civil sphere to keep these institutions, these communities also safe during this time. If you would go to the next. And I'm kind of coming to an end, and you could talk a lot more, of course, about the different aspects of what happened then, not only during these earlier periods of fighting, but also more recently, on the one hand, post-2001 and even post-2021. But one of the things that I think the last 20 years that was quite characteristic actually for many Sufi communities was that on the one hand, there was renewal, there was openness, there was, of course, war and conflict in some parts of the country, but not everywhere. The war looked different in different parts of the country, let's put it like this. There was generalized insecurity, but also for the Sufi communities, that generally meant that it was a state of impunity. So most of the Sufi communities, when they were targeted, when one of them was attacked, or when one of their Sufi lodges was attacked, there was very little follow-up. There was very little actually interest to shield them or to support them. So most Sufi communities felt very alone during this time, in which actually ideologies shifted and became even more hostile towards many of the Sufi community members. And if you go to the next slide, so there's you see some of the photos from, like, on the one hand, one of the shrines, on the other hand, also meetings. This was from one of the Sufi communities in the Kabul Polytechnic University, where they had their annual meeting. So there was very openly meetings and exchanges and discussions that were taking place, but it was by no means an easy time. If you would go to the next slide. And maybe what we can talk about maybe in the open Q&A, because I think I'm kind of at the end. I was asked to not speak maybe longer than 40 minutes, so I'm going to cut this off here, is maybe to talk maybe a bit about what happened in or with some of these communities in post-2021. This, by the way, is a drawing from the son of Ustad Haidari Wujudi, who you saw in an earlier photo as one of the teachers in Kabul's public library. Yeah, Thank you so much. I hope this was maybe a good starter for some of our discussion.
Thank you so much.